You are living in the most dangerous time in American history.
We won't take a single back step.
Former professional basketball player is now the Republican Party's choice.
Can you imagine Royce White, the U.S. Senate?
White won the endorsement on May 18th with 67% of the vote.
There's nothing that guarantees we win, but I guarantee you if we lose, we will die.
Towards other nations.
Because that would make them war criminals, according to your definition.
Right, like how we went and put weapons in the Ukraine.
So you would agree Putin is a war criminal?
What I'm saying is that we went and put weapons in the Ukraine. You know this to be true. We've been putting weapons in the Ukraine. We've been funding the Ukraine ever since.
Do you want to know who started shooting first? Who started shooting first, Royce?
Go ahead.
Who started shooting first?
You tell me.
Was it Russia? It was. You know the answer to that question.
No, I actually don't know the answer to that question.
Russia.
I actually don't know the question the answer to that question.
Yeah, Russia started shooting. So
based on what?
Defended themselves.
Based on what?
Because they wanted to
see when
take
people
back
say
the
Ukraine
USSR.
defended themselves. That again, this is how I know that you and many of the other Ron DeSantis people that we would talk to can say what they want about whatever they want. But when you get down to the bone of the matter, you are a neocon.
I'm a neocon. Okay.
You are. You just said that Ukraine just defended itself. No, we, through Ukraine, through a proxy, we're making threatening advances on Russia as the NATO alliance, those coalitions you were talking about earlier.
Yeah,
NATO's one of those coalitions, one of those global coalitions. You disagree with NATO, but you're saying that it's okay for them to put weapons right up on Russia's border.
I mean, I disagree with NATO. Abolish it.
Oh, but you agree with them putting weapons on Russia's border.
I disagree with it. Yes.
No, you agree with it because in order for you to disagree with it, then it would debunk your claim that Putin shot first.
I don't think the United States should fund
guess what?
NATO.
Guess what? If I'm a citizen and I pull a gun and I point it at a police officer, he has the right to shoot and kill me. If I'm a citizen and I pull and point a gun at another citizen, they have a right to shoot and kill me. This is what I'm talking about. You have a crisis of fundamental American beliefs, values, constitutional theory. We pointed a gun at Russia. Everybody knows it. They're scared to say it. And there's a part of the electorate that is scared to hear it. We pointed a gun at them first and then they shot. And anybody who doesn't see it,
that's not factually true.
It's not factually true.
It isn't.
So Russia didn't ask to be a part of the NATO alliance multiple times before we ran a coup there in Ukraine, replaced the president with Zelensky, and started advancing more weapons to the border?
History doesn't start and stop where you think is subjective. History happened hundreds of years before that as well.
So you mean to tell me after World War II was over that we didn't point the gun at them then too?
I played the clip from my recent debate with Dustin Grage because I don't think it could be more relevant. I don't think it could be more relevant. I don't think it could be more telling of what we're facing here in America, in American politics, but specifically in Minnesota. Minnesota, like I said on my last show, may be one of the best examples of uniparty politics in the entire country. One of the reasons is because there's such a contrast between what is a very, very prominent Minnesota ag community or Minnesota ag industry and our sort of Fortune 500 corporate metropolitan inner city area, inner city. And it's funny because when you grow up in a place like Minnesota, when you get involved in politics like here in Minnesota, you have a vantage into just what the uniparty is all about, what the agenda is all about. And we often talk about the establishment, the agenda, and in that clip, that 10-minute clip that you heard between me and Dustin Grage, you heard, him as a Ron Paul Republican say the quiet part out loud. He actually used the term tinfoil hat, which is pretty revealing, to say the least. I mean, first of all, everybody thought Ron Paul was a tinfoil hat kind of guy. Or no, I shouldn't say everybody. Ron Paul had a huge following and support, and I myself really, really like Ron Paul and everything that he talked about and the things that he stood for, the things he's continued to stand for, and ran some as well in the Senate today. So, you know, I would never even use the term tinfoil hat because it has so readily been connected with people who were telling or people who were saying things that very much needed to be said, such as Ron Paul himself. But somehow you get these Dustin Grage types, you know, these Minnesota Republicans, RINOs. They got the effeminate voice. You know, they got to check with their wives to make sure they can clear some time to debate politics, to debate issues with other men. Because, you know, like Dustin Grage said about a week back, didn't want to mess up his wife's routine. You know, his wife's got a routine. He doesn't want to mess that routine up. And hey, I'm not against families having routines. I'm not against women having routines when it comes to children and taking care of the household. And I'm not against men, you know, having communication with their wives about what's going on in their house, obviously. But we are in dire times. We are in times of crisis, especially when it comes to politics. And as much as Dustin Grage had a problem with me as a candidate or some of the things that I talk about, these tinfoil hat theories, you would think that he has just as much ambition, sense of urgency to come to the public square and defend his ideas and bring forward his own. By the end of that 10-minute clip that you just heard in the beginning, it's a cold open. He's not very interested in sharing his own ideas, bringing his own ideas, or even debunking mine for that matter. He's a guy, and again, I only bring this up as a segue to what we're going to talk about today. It is the great existential threat of our time, but I bring him up as an example, as somebody who is unique, but also not so unique in that unique person with a unique position, a unique sort of political history here in the local Minnesota politics, and unique in that he has you know, some type of online presence. So I mean, that is unique by the standards of your average American citizen or human being in today's society, but not so unique in that I think it is a widespread issue. I think we have a widespread problem of people who, for lack of a better term, are weak, are soft, are you know, just kind of assholes, you know, asinine, you know, just got a kind of a douchebag mentality, probably never been in a fist fight, you know, and you can hear it in their tone of voice, you know, their tone of, not to say that there aren't some people with higher tone voices that, you know, understand the consequences of the physical consequences of you know, of their actions. But there is something to be, I mean, there's a reason why your average military guy, your guys who've been to war, your guys who served, or your guys who played sports, your guys who you know, build with their hands, right? A couple of people brought up, you know, I think it was the gentleman who was there on CNN, black guy, and he made the point to the other black people on the panel that a lot of Donald Trump supporters are men who worked with their hands, right? And they didn't have this sort of esoteric, hyper philosophized, you know, vacuum sort of belief or view of the world. Their worldview was constructed by a more tangible, gritty, day to day. You know, they were built and bred in that sort of fiery crucible of the day to day grind. Athletes have that. A lot of athletes have that. Now, when you get to the top level in professional sports, a lot of athletes lose that because of the corporate sort of commercial, materialistic theater that goes on around professional sports. And that's why oftentimes you'll hear professional athletes talk differently in front of the camera for interviews or media than they do if you catch them on camera behind the scenes or in a personal setting. There's a reason. Because in that personal setting, who people usually really are is more grounded in reality, the reality of doing that tangible day-to-day hard work, gritty. I got to go to the gym like today. I was at the gym with the young boys with the young high school, the young men at 6:45 in the morning, and it's every day, and we're there every day, and it's the same exact thing every day, and it's the same sort of routine, and so there's something to be said for the crisis of our society falling away from toughness, grit. And there's something to also be said for a correlation between our affinity for or our gravity towards what you could call feminist sort of philosophy and politics versus some, traditional masculine led institutions, communities, households, etc. Right? Yeah, Dustin Grage, he's a prototype. He's a prototype, and it's on both sides of the aisle. That's why I think it's so valuable to hear. It's on both sides of the aisle. It's not just a Democrat thing. You hear it, you see it a lot on the Democrat side, no doubt, but it's a Republican thing too. And some of these Republican men have a crisis of masculinity, and that is probably the greatest existential threat in our society. There are ramifications, there are consequences. They say weak men make hard times, and I think we're not seeing. I don't think we've seen a better example of that than right now. I mean, we're on the brink of nuclear war. Everybody's kind of on the edge of their seat, and we're hoping that the Russians are bluffing. We're hoping that the Irans and the Chinas of the world are continuing to bluff, and maybe they are. Hey, maybe they're even in on it. That's a tinfoil hat theory, and maybe by the end I'll talk about that. But there's a lot of merit to that take on things. However, weak men do make hard times. There's no doubt about that. Weak men make hard times, and Dustin Grage is a very, very weak individual. And somehow he ends up with a voice that's reasonably big. I mean, compared to the entire world of online activity and social media contributors, like he said, I'm a columnist. He's a columnist for Town Hall. And I've seen Town Hall put out some good content. And I think, again, there are good people at Fox News, but there is a crisis of conservative media. There are a few huge blind spots in this conservative movement, and we have to continue to try and sort them out before it's too late. And that's why I did the debate with Dustin in the first place, because I know what the problem is in this party. I know what the problem is in this movement. I know what the problem is in this country. The problem are the Dustin Grages who say that they're Ron Paul Republicans, but they think that, I don't know, military industrial complex are more tinfoil hat conspiracy theories than they are real pertinent issues. And they'll even tell you that this is the scary part. This shows you the sort of crisis of morality and ethics and integrity that these people have. They'll even tell you that they oppose the military industrial complex. They'll even tell you that they oppose certain globalist institutions or ideologies like NATO. But when you really get down to the bone, when you really start to chew all the way down to the bone and to the gristle in a conversation, they come right out and show you that that's more or less theater. It's like political cosplay. We got rhinos and neocons now, I discover, cosplaying as Ron Paul people. It's just, it's a widespread issue. It's not just Dustin Grage. This isn't one douchebag that we are gonna pull out or pluck out of the party and all of a sudden our issues are solved. No. This is an ethos. This is a sort of spiritual and political and cultural ethos that exists in the conservative movement, more so the mainstream, silk stocking, silk tie, lapel pin, country club, Republican mainstream, and all of its ancillary, all of the people that it reaches, that it reaches in the ancillaries. That's where a lot of this exists. And you'll see them. They contribute to Fox News. They contribute to the online equivalents of written publications and whatnot. I mean, they're all throughout the party. They're all over the place. I mean, it's And they don't like Donald Trump. And they don't like Donald Trump for a reason. You know, these people are weak. They're weak individuals. And the reason why it's such a problem is because just like with the left, where you have that sort of beta male mentality. I remember one time I wrote a piece, a section in one of my Substacks about the dynamic between the alpha and the beta males. And the beta males have the tendency to sort of coalesce in a majority, a super majority, really any majority they can. But the goal is to coalesce themselves in a super majority to be able to offset what they lack in comparison to the alphas. And that in actuality is one of the dark and pernicious undertones of democracy itself. And it's tricky. It's tricky because, Vox Populi, Vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. And I do believe that the will of the people is, especially as an American citizen, the will of the people is what should speak. But that's why it's so important that the people are educated and trained in a sense, and sort of conditioned in what we would call sacred honor and national honor. Because when they're not, then the majority becomes corrupt, and it becomes a reflection of man's cowardice. And right now, mankind, especially in this country, let's just keep it here in America. Right now, the American public, our American people, American men are suffering from a profound cowardice. And we have a bunch of people that, there are a bunch, and I'm not saying it to be disrespectful. I really am. I'm not. We have a crisis of fundamental, right? Of fundamental beliefs and values and ideas. There's a crisis in the fundamental because we've abnegated philosophy. There's a philosophical bankruptcy, which can only lead to a crisis of the fundamental. And it's not by accident that our education system has done such a poor job of educating our young people in first principles, philosophy, history, politics, civic duty, so on and so forth. There's a reason. It was done intentionally because it will inevitably produce Dustin Grages, who really struggle with logical coherence. And it showed in that small little soundbite of conversation. It showed the crisis of logic. For example, you can't say that you don't like NATO. Now arriving to our conversation today. You can't say that you don't like NATO, that you think we should abolish NATO, but then you preserve the narrative that Vladimir Putin is a war criminal because he essentially waged a war against NATO. The two things don't really compute. Now, two things can be true at the same time, but those two things specifically are very hard to square, especially if you know the history of NATO, especially if you know the recent history of NATO in the region. And as I explained to Dustin, on this X space and in this debate, NATO has continued to do what many on the left even, which was strange that they went so far out of their way to defend Ukraine in the first place, or defend the entire Eastern Bloc or Eastern Europe or whatever the case. What NATO, it's strange that they went so far their way to defend NATO, really told you a lot about who the modern day liberal and Democrat elites are. But it's strange because NATO is an example of Western arrogance, and it really is. And a lot of conservatives get this wrong too. I'm just not afraid to call the balls and strikes on many issues, but certainly not this one. Certainly when it comes to geopolitics and foreign policy, NATO is an example of Western arrogance. Yeah, we think, NATO thinks that it should be able to tell everybody else how to live. And we suffer from that here in America as well. And that sort of is the beating heart of the globalist crisis that we've created and that we have to carry as American citizens. We have a global crisis of Western arrogance. And it's twofold. Part of our Western arrogance is thinking we can tell other people how to live. The other part of our Western arrogance is thinking that we can sustain the value of American citizenship while telling other people how to live and defending that dictatorship if necessary, by kinetic means, by military means. And that's what you're seeing there in the heartland. They call it the heartland to sort of reference an inflection point in this entire Russia-Ukraine, or let's say European theater of geopolitical conflict. This goes all the way back to Halford John Mackinder and the World Island theory. He who controls Eastern Europe controls the heartland. He who controls the heartland controls the Eurasian World Island. And the heartland is exactly where they're fighting the war for Ukraine today. The breadbasket of Europe, black dirt. I mean, there's so many interests there. I mean, there's the geographical interest. There's the natural resource interest. There's the political interest. It's so complicated yet so simple. The simple fact of the matter for us as Americans is we don't get to tell the entire world how to live. It's not our job to police the entire planet. It's not our job to police the entire world. It's not our job to police Europe. It's not our job to police the Eurasian World Island. It's not our job. It's not a job we can do. Let's just say first and foremost, it's not a job we can accomplish. And we're failing. I mean, it's already failed. There's no post-mortem. I mean, there's no ex post facto here. We are now in the post-mortem. We've already failed. And we failed to police the entire world through the democratic liberal order. It didn't work. And I've said it again, but I'll continue to stress it until the average American citizen understands it as well. The reason why the democratic liberal order didn't work isn't because the fundamental was bad. The fundamental of freedom, the idea of freedom, stretching to the far corners of the earth or to the far corners of civilization is a good thing. The idea of having democratic process where people get a say, where each individual citizen, based on their freedom and rights, gets a say in choosing their elected officials and their political leaders, that is a good fundamental. Where it went wrong was our motivation wasn't genuine. We really didn't want these countries to be self-determining. We wanted them dependent on us. We wanted them dependent on the idea of global coalitions. Another word that Dustin Grage used in that soundbite, he said that I, Royce, neither embraced the idea of coalitions, let alone try and build them. And I told him right there in the clip, the only coalitions that we need are coalitions of people who tell the truth. And that is a crisis of our coalitions. And it doesn't get easier to see that crisis in our coalitions than when we look at the global coalitions like NATO, for example. Our NATO coalition isn't genuine. There's nothing genuine about it. And Donald Trump had the courage, the backbone, the balls, let's say, to even question NATO, on a fundamental basis, whether or not we should be in NATO, whether or not NATO's upholding its end of the bargain, or whether or not the members, the different allies in NATO are upholding their end of the bargain. He was the first one to even question it. I may be taking it a step further. I say we should get out of NATO. And Dustin Grage can say that he wants to pull out of NATO, but when you say that Vladimir Putin is a war criminal, you're kind of upholding the entire justification for NATO. In fact, you're not kind of doing it. You are doing it. If you say that Vladimir Putin is a war criminal, you're upholding the justification for the NATO alliance. And I thought I drew a pretty good example of why calling Vladimir Putin a war criminal would be a bit off color for anybody who regards themselves an American citizen. And I know there are a lot of people who say, I'm an American. I believe in the Constitution and citizenship and blah, blah, blah. And this is on the Republican side. But do they understand the fundamental of citizenship? Do they understand the fundamentals of American citizenship? Remember, their citizenship in general, their citizenship independent of any one particular nation. And then their citizenship with regards to our country, our specific nation. And American citizenship is very different than other citizenship, other forms of national identity because of our beliefs. One of those beliefs is you have a right to defend yourself. But the right to defend yourself doesn't start when you get attacked. The right to defend yourself starts when there is a credible and perceivable threat. I hope everybody out there understands that. I don't mean to, and I hope I don't talk highbrow. I had some people tell me, maybe you talk a little too highbrow. Maybe the YouTube algorithm doesn't like people who just tell it like it is. I hope this isn't highbrow. There is citizenship in general, and then there is American citizenship, and this distinction between American citizenship and all other forms of citizenship. Just like the distinction between any nation's citizenship usually has to do with their fundamental beliefs and ideals. In America, one of the most important fundamental beliefs and ideals that we have is you as an individual citizen has rights. You have constitutional rights, and even more importantly, you have God-given rights. Rights granted to you by a creator that are inalienable. These rights that we hold to be self-evident. These rights are regarded as self-evident in our culture, in our governmental structure, in our laws. And one of those rights is you have the right to defend yourself. You have the right to defend your own life. You have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property and prosperity and happiness. Part of that right to life is the right to defend my own life against a perceivable threat. Well, if we say that NATO as a global coalition, an alliance, if we say that the post-World War II democratic liberal order or the United Nations or any of these other post-World War II programs and projects, if we say that these institutions were based on America's fundamental ideas, the ideas that made America great, and we want to try and bring them to other nations or other parts of the world to make them or to give them the chance at the prosperity that America has experienced, then those American values have to be upheld, even if we're not the country to decide if they get upheld. We have to uphold them culturally as a narrative. In the narrative, we have to uphold that logical coherence. We have to keep a sequential sort of coherence in the principle. In the fundamental, in the moral, in the ethic. And if we don't, then we're not America, and we're not American citizens. We're not the country that gets to decide, that ultimately should get to decide, what rights, what ideas, what beliefs are upheld there in the heartland, in Eastern Europe or Western Russia. We don't get to decide that. The people there in Ukraine get to decide that. The people there in Western Russia get to decide that. The people in Europe and Asia, the people of the Mediterranean, the people in the Sino-Japanese, they get to decide, and they should be able to decide, what takes place, in that area. They should be able to self-govern. They get to decide their own future. It's self-determination. That's what we said that the Atlantic Charter and all these other post-World War II institutions were going to do. They were going to give people the opportunity to be self-determining. That doesn't mean that anytime one of these countries is in trouble, we come in and determine their future for them. That's not right. That's fundamentally flawed. That's actually corruption. That's just corruption. When we say, hey, we're going to give you the chance to determine your own future. But if you find yourself in some trouble, we're going to then come and determine your future for you. That's not genuine. That's ridiculous. And that's what we're doing. But even furthermore, as we do it, we don't even uphold the values that we say we have here in America. For example, and I use this example in the clip, as a citizen, if I point a gun at a police officer, if I point a gun at a police officer and he shoots and kills me, that's justified. Now, if I don't actually point my gun at the police officer and he kills me, or if he kills me and it's not justified, then it's not justified. But if there is factual evidence to the standard of a court of law and the peers or the jury that would oversee those judicial proceedings, then that's justified. If I pull a gun and point a gun at a cop and he shoots and kills me, he has every right to do so. If as a citizen I pull and point a gun at another citizen, they have every right to shoot and kill me. They don't have to wait for me to start shooting. You understand? I hope everybody understands where we're going here. If I'm a citizen or a cop and somebody pulls a gun and points it at me, I have the right to kill that person immediately. I don't have to wait for them to start shooting me. I don't have to wait for them to start shooting in my direction. I get to shoot as soon as there is a credible, perceivable threat to my life. So why doesn't that same standard ethic, why doesn't that same legal theory apply to our geopolitics, to our international relationships? And see, there is where NATO showed, the people who lead NATO, some of them Americans, some of them other Westerners, but the people who lead NATO show that they don't really believe in the fundamental morals and ethics of our American citizenship and identity. And therefore, it's egregious that American citizens, that America upholds, financially upholds and subsidizes the NATO alliance. It's egregious that we pay the cost, we pay for the NATO alliance to exist by all reasonable metrics. We pay to uphold NATO, we subsidize NATO, yet they don't really believe in American values, American ideals, fundamental American ideals. Not on the surface, I mean down at the base, at the bottom, the roots. They don't believe in those ideals. We can't say that we're trying to help them be self-determining. Part of that self-determination comes from the baseline idea, moral ethic, fundamental of freedom, individual freedom that is granted to us by a creator, inalienable. It's viewed to be self-evident. That is, freedom is one of those fundamental ethics. You have the freedom, you have the right to life, which means you have the right to defend your life in situations where the threat is credible. But that doesn't count when we get to the world stage and we're talking about, international military conflict. Give me a break. Who do these people think they're fooling? And that's why they don't like me, because I can take a situation and bring it all the way back down to the fundamental and be able to call the balls and strikes. And this is a simple one. Vladimir Putin is not a war criminal. He may be an asshole. He may be a bad guy. He may be a liar. He may be a communist, hiding as or fronting as a capitalist. He may be a totalitarian dictator, an evil totalitarian dictator posing as a Christian. I don't know who the man is. I've never met him. I know when I hear him talk, he sounds pretty reasonable, but we have a similar problem here in our country. A lot of people sound reasonable when you put them in front of a camera or microphone, and you get them behind closed doors and they're Satanists. They have this sort of anti-human, anti-American, anti-freedom, demonic possession going on. And they could window dress it up however they want. So I don't know who Vladimir Putin really is. I know who he presents himself to be. And that could always be a bit different than who he really is. But what I can say is I can't qualify him as a war criminal. The reason I can't qualify him as a war criminal is because we pointed a gun at Russia first. And we did. We pointed a gun at Russia first recently and historically, going all the way back to the middle 1800s. The West has been pointing a gun at Russia for the better part of 200-something years. And that doesn't make me a fan of Russia. That doesn't make me pro-Putin. To be able to reference the encyclopedia history that anybody can go and reference. I mean, watch now. They're going to try and change the history books, but some of this history is still right there for you to go read. It's not even hidden. It's not even hidden. You know, it was Napoleon. Napoleon invaded Russia. He had no good reason to invade Russia. He just wanted it. And then it was Hitler. And you could argue that Hitler had at least a better justification for invading Russia than Napoleon did in some respects. But, again, Hitler himself, he was a maniac. Clearly, objectively, he was a maniac. And a maniac can sometimes have a good reason for doing something and still be a maniac. And that's the same thing I'm saying about Vladimir Putin. You may say that he's crazy. You could call him a maniac for starting a war, but you can't say that the war is not justified. See, and you have to be able to make that nuanced distinction there. And when you can't, you have failed. You have failed in your civic duty of being an American citizen, because in order to be an American citizen, there's a certain civic duty. Part of that civic duty is when you go to cast a ballot, when you go to spend $1, when you go to contribute to a conversation, a common conversation, a casual conversation, and politics comes up. Maybe it's with your friends. Maybe it's with your spouse. Maybe it's with your children. Maybe you're a teacher. Maybe it's with your students. I don't know. But when you go to contribute to the society you live in, that contribution becomes a measurement of how good a citizen you are. And when you can't make those nuanced distinctions, you fail to contribute in a way that's substantive. And we do that a lot. And there's even a lot of smart and articulate people who are suffering in this department. And again, that is a crisis of leadership, but it's also a crisis and a failure of our standards as American citizens. What we say we expect from our schools, from our media, from our teachers, from our pundits and commentators and content creators and our politicians and our bureaucrats, and the list goes on and on. What we expect, the standard that we set as a people, as a populace, we are failing in. Our standards have failed, because we don't want politicians who can make that distinguishable, can make that nuanced distinction there. Yeah, you can be a maniac, yet still be involved in a war that's justified. Those two things are possible. Theoretically. Does it happen often? No, oftentimes somebody's maniacal personality flaws, their spiritual flaws, do undermine the overall integrity of the campaign they say that they're waging against another group of people, or that's often the case. Here we find a unique example where Vladimir Putin may be a maniac, but the war he's involved in, the war that he started, quote unquote, again, I put that in air quotes for a reason, because I'm not conceding that he started the war, but the war that he recently shot in is a justified war by our own standards, by American standards, on two fronts. The first standard is this: we used Russia, we used the Eastern Bloc to stage weapons, small arms, tactical missiles, strategic tactical, small range tactical missiles, and other forms of weapon systems. We staged all throughout Eastern Europe and the Eastern Bloc, whether it was bringing a country into NATO formally, or whether it was informal, like in Ukraine, where we ran a coup in Ukraine. And we ran a coup in Ukraine. That's not even contentious. That's not even a contested theory. There's nothing tinfoil hat about that. We ran a coup against the regime in Ukraine, and we put Zelensky in place. We established Zelensky, the guy. We have been involved in Ukraine heavily since. I mean, more recently, it was 2014, but even before that, We've been involved there in Ukraine for a while now. And our reason for being there, our justification for being there is that Russia is the great geopolitical existential threat to America, stability, freedom, security, etc. That's the only reason we're there in Ukraine. We're not there for the Ukrainian people. We're not there because we care so much that Ukrainians' government and Ukraine's society functions properly without corruption. There's no evidence whatsoever that America or the rest of the European Union's involvement in Ukraine is for some altruistic desire for Ukraine to be, rid of its corruption. There is not a 1 ounce of evidence that would suggest anything we're doing in Ukraine has anything to do with our desire to rid the Ukrainian people of the corruption in their country. Not an ounce of evidence. We are there because it's in our strategic military interest, economic interest, political interest to have a foothold in a place very close to our national mortal enemy, Russia. And so we've been staging weapons there. We've been staging weapons there. But this isn't an argument. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's not a debate. It's not debatable. We've been staging weapons there in Ukraine. And like I said earlier, when you point a gun at somebody else, they don't have to wait for you to start shooting to shoot at you. That's not the way it works. That's not an American belief. That's not an American idea. In America, if you pull a gun on me, I have every right to do everything in my power to prevent you from harming me at all, to prevent you from doing any bodily harm whatsoever. I don't have to wait to get shot in the chest the first time to try and duck out of the way or to pull my own gun and start to shoot back. That's not American. So it's not American for us to say that Vladimir Putin is in the wrong in invading a country where other countries, enemy countries, other international rivals are placing weapons that threaten the security of Russia. And there's an easy way there's an easy litmus test here. Ask yourself, would we allow Russia or China or Iran or North Korea to stage short-arm ballistic missiles in Mexico? We've already been through this. This is what blows my mind. People watch so much television and they're so gum-dipped in this mainstream media globalist propaganda. We forget that this history has already this history has already happened. I mean, this history we've already been through. Russia tried to stage missiles in Cuba. We weren't having it. We went to go invade Cuba. There was an entire false flag operation in the Bay of Pigs. There was an entire military operation to ensure that Russia would not have a strong foothold in Cuba and be able to stage what was then potentially nuclear weapons and point them at America. And we were willing to preemptive strike. And nobody had a problem with that then. Actually, some people had a problem with the false flag that went on because, there were people who argued, said that, that these were shadow elements of our government that didn't really run it by Kennedy. Maybe Kennedy didn't know, Kennedy didn't okay it, so on and so forth. So, there was a lot of contention about how that whole thing went down. But ultimately, people understood the concept that it's not okay for Russia to put weapons there in Cuba. They're too close to us. Too close. Just like if somebody comes and moves into the house next door and you can smell the fumes or the sort of, the odor of some type of chemical process that could be drugs or some other hazardous material coming up from the basement, coming up from underneath the home. Oh, it's too close to my house. Is it happening somewhere in America? Is it happening somewhere in my city limits? Is it happening somewhere out there? Maybe. But if it gets too close to my house, I got a problem with it. Now I got to either come knock on the door, I got to report it to the authorities as being suspicious, or something has to happen. But I'm not going to sit here and wait for whatever it is that you're doing to affect me negatively. That's an American value. The same thing goes for Russia. Russia has every right to look at us putting weapons closer and closer to their border and go, we're not letting you put, wait a second, you're getting too close. And they said it time and time again. They complained. You can go read through the history, the United Nations and other international summits and other statements that the Russian administration, the Russian Federation made. They're getting too close. There's an aggression that's being perceived here. We don't like it. You're getting too close. NATO, you're getting too close. And there's even Russia on the record in recent years. And I say recent, in the last 2 decades, there's even times where Russia tried to quell the animosity by floating the idea of actually joining NATO, saying, hey, if we're going to have these ballistic missile systems, let's do it together. Let's have these anti-missile systems be a real coalition, and we'll join in on. And America didn't want to do that. America slapped Russia's hand down. And hey, you could argue, well, you were communist then, you might be communist now. We don't know. And there's plenty of merit to hold that skepticism or retain our skepticism about Russia. I'm not saying we should believe them on face value, but I am saying we have to deal in good faith. We have to deal in good conscience, and we have to uphold our own values, or really you become your enemy. And there's a part of this that's spiritual that says, at the moment where you sink to the level of your enemy, there's a part of you that becomes the enemy. I have seen the enemy, and the enemy is me. And there's a part of war. There is a part of war that brings that out of both sides, which again, at that level, when I said the bad guys won World War II, or I said there were no quote unquote good guys, what I'm saying is that when 76 million people die, when 76 million people are killed in war, no matter which side you were on, you take the worst out of war back with you spiritually. And you'd be hard-pressed to convince me how World War I or World War II, for that matter, was a righteous and divine war, was a spiritual campaign. You'd be hard-pressed to convince me of that now. Show me the history, make the case. And if somebody wants to debate, I'm more than open. Maybe you have better, grasp of World War II than I do. But when I look at World War I and World War II, I look at the predicate, the precursors of a calamity that we face again today, where a bunch of geopolitical interests find themselves at these fault lines, pointing a gun at one another, just waiting to see who shoots first, and then spills on into a full-blown global conflict. That's how World War I. That's how World War I broke out. It's how World War II broke out, and it would seem it's how World War III is going to break out here shortly. Or let's say it's already broken out. Let's be clear. World War III, it's already broken out. The question is how big and how far is the thing going to go? How far is it going to get? But it's already begun. We've been through this before. We would never allow Russia or China or Iran or North Korea or anybody else threatening enough, for that matter, to stage weapons in Mexico, in Canada. If the Russians decided to stage short-range ballistic missiles in Mexico, there would be no more Mexico. And I don't care who the president was. If the president was a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, the Green Party, it wouldn't matter to me. It doesn't matter who the president would be, theoretically. If Russia started putting missiles in Mexico, Mexico's going bye-bye. And whoever that president is not going to be considered a war criminal in my eyes. Now, the general public may come to a different consensus. But for me personally, as somebody who's running if I was a United States senator, I would, under no circumstances would I even flirt with the idea of calling a president a war criminal for preemptively striking when, and this goes back to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine says you have the right to police your own neighborhood. And if we believe that the Monroe Doctrine is simply a Western idea or only applies to Western countries, then we've undermined the fundamental. We've undermined the ethic. We've certainly undermined this project that we've undergone since World War II, where we spent countless hours and energy and resources and human sweat and blood to go and make these other countries self-determining. If we're going to make these other countries self-determining and they don't share in the Monroe Doctrine where they get to police their own neighborhood, the whole thing is a scam. And it is a fucking scam. That's what I'm saying. Here in the West, we have the Monroe Doctrine. We think, hey, we get to police our own neighborhood for the most part. Everywhere else across the sea, really, everywhere else across the ocean, we get to police everybody else's shit. And it's costing us too much money, and it's getting too complicated. It's getting too confusing to see who our friends and who our enemies are. For example, we're in this full-blown war with Russia, and we are in a war. It's a proxy war, but shit, when we start sending long-range missiles for Ukraine, Joe Biden, you pompous, arrogant fuck, you're sending Ukraine long-range missiles to shoot into Russia, trying to provoke a war. I don't know. Maybe they think, maybe they think like some other folks, Bibi Netanyahu, for example. Maybe they think that if they start a war, then they won't have to give up power. And Bibi was under a bunch of scrutiny before this war broke out there in the Middle East, this most recent war. He was under a lot of scrutiny. The conventional wisdom was he was getting voted out. Some people thought he might have been going to jail. It's not my business. I don't live in Israel. So, Israeli politics and what's going on with Bibi Netanyahu, that's their business. That's part of being self-determining. They got to figure that out. The will of their people will figure that out. But I know he was under a lot of scrutiny. And I know him being involved in this war sort of forewent the political process that was taking place at the time, or that was underway. And right now, maybe our leaders think the same thing. Maybe they think in this next 30 days, long shot, but we'll shoot it anyway to see if we can avoid a transfer of power based on wartime clause. Maybe. So again, we give weapons to Ukraine. We're in the war. Well, we're in a war with Ukraine. I mean, with Russia. That's just what it is. We're in the war. In a war, in a war, people have the right to go about war the way that they see fit. Even that's a scam. And we are in a war, but still, we still cooperate in our space ventures. See, this is the kind of shit that gets spooky. Right now, we are in a full-blown proxy or kinetic war with Russia, yet the international space stations of both countries are still working together in space endeavors. Shit's creepy. Shit's spooky. That's spooky. I mean, you would think the first thing that will get suspended, and maybe there's a sort of unspoken, artificial ceiling here to the conflict that's held together by our joint space ventures. That could be what both countries are doing. They're saying, hey, we'll shoot at each other to a certain altitude, but we're going to keep space capped off. And as long as we keep working together in space, it's putting a threshold on how bad the conflict could get, given how advanced technology is. And if a full-blown kinetic war broke out, you would see some space altitude level exchange of fire. So maybe that's what's happening. And if that's the case, then praise be to God. Blessed is the peacemaker. People have some temperance. But I don't know. I don't know that to be the case. I don't know what's going on here. I know the narrative isn't right. Let's just keep it there. I know the narrative makes no sense whatsoever. The narrative that Vladimir Putin is a war criminal and we should be able to put weapons right up on his border is ridiculous. And not only is it ridiculous for Russia, I'm actually more worried about it because there's such a strong anti-American ethos in the global zeitgeist. I mean, there's such a profound hostility towards America and the West. I'm worried about setting a precedent against our own country. honestly. And see, that's how the double cross and triple cross works. They could call Vladimir Putin a war criminal today for invading Ukraine, but it may be us tomorrow for invading Mexico. And we may need to invade Mexico. And it's not just about some foreign nation putting missiles there. It may be the cartels in general. We don't know. They'll use this as a, a two for one, a 3 for 1. We don't know. These people are playing the game at a level much higher than us with much more time and many more resources. We don't know that they use the precedent set. If the International Criminal Court and the entire international community concedes and comes to the consensus that Vladimir Putin is in fact a war criminal, and that Russia is wrong for defending itself. Remember, somebody comes to my front yard, pulls a gun on me, pulls a gun out and points it at me. I have the right to defend myself right then. I don't have to wait for him to shoot. I have a right then and there to defend myself, to defend my home, to defend my family, to defend my property. I have a right. I don't have to wait for them to start shooting. So actually, Russia defended itself. Yeah, absolutely. We put missiles there. We pointed them at Russia. And they were pointed at Russia. Everybody knows it. Victoria Nuland, Bob Keegan. You may not know who these people are. Go get familiar with the names. They were in charge of this entire anti-Russian proto-Ukraine theater that's taking place right now. These were the thought leaders. These were the emissaries, the ambassadors. These were the international dignitaries that have been overseeing this thing, along with the Amy Klobuchars and some of the other elected officials. But we pointed a gun at Russia. We've been pointing more and more guns at Russia. And you could try and say it's justified because of who Vladimir Putin is, but that dog ain't going to hunt. That dog ain't going to hunt. Somebody has to have committed a credible crime, or there must be a credible threat in order to take certain types of action. Now, if you want to go all the way back to the start of the Cold War and say that the arms race for this space superiority or even the atom bomb, if you want to say that those arms races were theoretically Russia pointing a gun at America, the West, or the rest of the world, fine. You can say that. But again, then the entire narrative about World War II is broken because we weren't the Allied forces. We were two countries that never trusted each other. One of us perceived the other one to be about as evil and untrustworthy as you could possibly imagine, as you could humanly imagine between two political entities. We had so much distrust for one another that the distrust would withstand a century until we started a kinetic war again today. So both narratives can't be true. Both stories don't square. No, the real story is probably something more like we always knew that Russia was going to be a threat. Why did we know? Because we were completely aware that Russia was a totalitarian communist regime, and that in Russia, in Stalin ran Russia, 20 million Christians and many others were genocided. We knew that form of government, that sort of ideology, that type of totalitarianism was a threat. But we also knew that if the Germans and the Russians found any type of alliance whatsoever, then all of Greater Europe and the rest of Asia would go as well. And that was the case. And this isn't a conspiracy theory. This comes from the academic and intellectual tradition of Great Britain and the Crown and Halford John Mackinder. He laid it out plain in the geographical pivot of history, in the treatise, you could call it, the treatise, A Geographical Pivot of History, written by Halford John Mackinder. He laid out a few scenarios that could potentially be the springboard to domination of the Eurasian world island. And one of those scenarios was if there was a German-Russo alliance that would conquer the heartland and give them superiority over the entire Eastern Hemisphere. It's written. It was written before World War I started, which tells you a lot about where the geopolitical zeitgeist was there in Great Britain regarding the rest of Europe and the rest of Asia. I mean, this discussion was already taking place. What is the future going to hold now that the Industrial Revolution has begun and the weaponry and technology and all these other things, including war, full-blown, full-scale war, is going to start to shift? What are the implications? How do we get ready for this? The geographical pivot of history had warned the crown that if a German-Russo alliance ever came to be, the crown would cease to exist. The sun would set on the British Empire. You get World War I, you get World War II, a German-Russian alliance never came to be. In fact, they're more mortal enemies than they could have ever been allies. In fact, in World War II, it was written right in Hitler's own personal diaries that he resented. He resented Chamberlain. He resented Great Britain and the crown for not aiding him in his conquest with Russia. He resented them, almost as if he believed that Great Britain would come to his aid. Why did he believe that? Because the intellectual and academic tradition from Europe all the way down to Germany taught that Great Britain and Russia had been a part of a geopolitical conflict known as the Great Game through a number of different proxy countries. So the alliance never came to pass. Russia was a bad hombre. They weren't good people either. We knew that, but the West felt they needed them to defeat a power or a force they thought was even more dangerous. And that was the rise of this Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and what would later become Japan. Those seem like bigger threats. So we did a deal with the devil. And in this case, I'm saying that the communist totalitarian regime in Russia that genocided 20 million Christians was indeed the devil of that day. We did a deal with the devil to beat a power or force that we found more threatening. But as soon as it was over, we pointed our guns back at one another. This was the start of the Cold War. This is conventional history. I don't know where we're and then you get the Dustin Grages who say, well, your way of talking about how history works and the facts this is all factual. This is how it went. Now, along the way, you could have all kinds of political voices and pundits and elected officials or whoever give whatever sort of window dressing and excuses they want to or needed to at the time for their own individual agenda at the time. But if you look at the broad arc of what went on, this is what happened. We fought a war against the Axis powers. We aligned ourselves with the devil. We would then turn around and point our gun at as soon as the threat was gone. Okay, we pointed our guns at each other at the same time. Let's even say that. Between us and Russia, we pointed our guns at each other right after World War II. That was the start of it, most recently. It goes back further with Great Britain. But most recently, after World War II, us and the Russians pointed our guns at each other. Okay. Along the way, there's been negotiations. There's been agreements. There's been things that were said, things that are believed to have been said. There was a strengthening of alliances and so on and so forth. A lot of things have gone on since. But when Bill Clinton was in office, a bunch of these neocons, and Bill Clinton, he's a neocon too. Don't get it twisted. Don't let the Clinton Foundation fool you, okay? The intelligence community, the Department of Defense, they came to Clinton early in his administration, and we unilaterally withdrew from the treaty, the anti-missile treaty. That was the flashpoint, and this was right when Vladimir Putin was kind of starting to make headway. And we unilaterally pulled out of the agreement. And that was and from that point on, about the mid-90s, we saw a continued expansion of NATO. We saw a continued expansion of NATO until all of a sudden we're putting weapons right there in Ukraine. Okay, now who's pointing a gun at who? I mean, give me a break. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? We're right there on their border. I wish you would bring small arms to tactical, short-range ballistic missiles to Puerto Rico, to Cuba, to Haiti, to Mexico, to Canada. It ain't happening. It ain't. I wish somebody would try and come put, small arms there in Hawaii, or I mean, it's just not even an option. We would go full-blown kinetic before we ever saw any foreign nation, let alone a historical enemy, adversary, put weapons close to our border. It's the Western arrogance. Yeah. And if we are at a place where the tension between us and Russia is so palpable, the tension is so high that we have to forego our own morals, our own values, our own ideals in order to defeat them, we got to ask ourselves, is that a war we want to fight? And for who? For the betterment, for the territorial integrity of greater Europe? Are we willing to be? Remember, we fought a war to defect from the crown. We fought a war to become independent. And now we're going to, let's say, demean our own values and beliefs in order to defend their territory? Well, number one, we better make sure that our beliefs and our values are actually in alignment with Europe's. I mean, we talk about the Commonwealth, we talk about Western civilization, but I don't too much see how there even is such a thing as Western civilization. I kind of believe that this whole Western civilization narrative is somewhat of a scam. I see America, and that doesn't make me an isolationist. It makes me a realist. Look at Australia there during COVID. Anything American about how they handled COVID? Is there anything American about how the Aussies dealt with COVID, how they're dealing with censorship? I'm just being for real, guys. I mean, we got to start having these grown-up conversations. I don't see anything American about how Australia dealt with COVID and how they're dealing with censorship. I don't see anything American about how some of these European political oligarchs are dealing with the migration crisis to their own country and the value of their own citizenship. I don't even see that they really value the idea of citizenship so much in Europe writ large. And it's an entirely different country. I mean, in America, we have a unique grasp of our own citizenship and our own place in the world because, because of our geography. I mean, really, Europe is a much different place, obviously, because of its geography. I mean, it's just, again, the geographical pivot of history. There's a reason why the treaties and the theory was laid out the way it was laid out, because there is a real concrete sort of physical element to politics, to culture, to the way a society is run and the way a society is shaped and the way a society functions. That's a real thing. And in Europe, you could get in a car and just drive from Germany to France, to Spain. I mean, it's 6-7 hours. You can go from one country to the next. You could drive to the Eastern Bloc. You could drive to Russia, right? I mean, that's an element of that's an element in reality of living in that part of the world. America, we don't have that same reality. So, we do have a sort of heightened sense of citizenship and guarding our territory, because it's like, hey, we're not used to people being able to just drive up to America and stroll on in. Now, a lot of that has changed since air travel has become more prominent in international business and trade. And obviously we have a huge crisis there at our southern border. But as far as Canada goes, it's not very populated. And people in Canada, they kind of like Canada, right? They like, you don't see and hear about a lot of Canadians traveling back and forth to the United States all the time, because that's just not a real thing. And it's a more small populated country anyway, relatively speaking. There's 30 million people live in one of the biggest pieces of land in all of the world. So we have a different sense of territory, geography, and citizenship than Europe does. But it is different. I mean, it is different. Like we can't dance around it being different. It's just different. We feel differently about American citizenship than they do about European citizenship. Obviously. And we have to think about that right now on the brink of World War III. How far are we willing to go with this? What are we willing to sacrifice? These are the questions that have to be asked, and they have to be answered, and they're going to have to be asked and answered quick. This isn't going to be there are no easy answers. Are we willing to reinstitute the draft? Are you willing to have your young people drafted again? Again? To go defend Europe? Or is there a peace to be made? Is there a peace to be made that involves allowing Russia to have a little bit of what Russia wants and Ukraine to have a little bit less of what they want? And hey, every deal is done with the bigger wallet, the bigger gun, the bigger sword, and it's still been that way even though we said we were going to go around the world and put people on an equal footing and make them self-determining. America doesn't operate like that. Oh, we threaten people all the time. Yeah, America threatens people all the time in our international political dealings. All the time. We say, you're going to take the short end of the stick or else. You're going to take the short end of the stick because. We do it all the time. And so now when the shoe's on the other foot and Russia says, hey, Ukraine's going to get the short end of the stick because we're the big boy over here. We're the big dog in this yard. Now all of a sudden we have a problem with it? We can't stomach it? It's the Western arrogance. And the crazy thing is the same liberals who say that Western society is a sort of scourge on the planet, that Western society is nothing but a remnant of this tyrannical white patriarchy that finds itself superior than any other in all people. It's those same liberals that are willing to go to nuclear war to uphold the territorial integrity of Europe. And you got to ask yourself, why? Maybe a part of them just wants that destruction. That's what I mean, to go back to a couple podcasts ago when I explained that nihilism, that nihilism and Marxism and that sort of what gets masked as secular humanism is actually an impulse, an ambition for destruction, self-destruction even. There's a sort of self-destructive streak in that modern liberal ethos. I'm telling you all. Part of us wanted to defend Ukraine, which has no strategic interest for us whatsoever. It's sort of self-hatred and self-destructive trait that we have in the West. In America, more specifically. And we have to be wary of these people. We have to be vigilant. We don't need to let them force us into some quagmire. Some nuclear quagmire for that matter. We don't have to let these people force us into that. We just got to ask ourselves the adult question. What does this benefit us? Cui bono. Who does it benefit? It doesn't even benefit the people of Ukraine. It doesn't benefit the people of Europe to go into a war, a full-blown kinetic war with Russia. They're the ones who are most at risk, the most at immediate risk. What does Russia really want? What are they really asking for? What are they really asking for that can't be, that can't be accommodated? And now the obvious example that people reference back to is say, well, Hitler was going around and taking pieces of territory as well, and so people conceded to him, and some of that was Great Britain. Great Britain, on multiple occasions, tried to accommodate Hitler's requests, and that is a part of the factual history as well. So you could argue that Great Britain and other Western forces, European countries, are just as much culpable for the atrocity and the genocide that happened to the Jews as the Germans are. They were complicit. They should have held the line and said, hey, we're not, no negotiations whatsoever. Okay, you could make that argument. Some people do. But what is it that Russia is actually asking for, or what is it that Russia has done that's comparable? See, because they try and compare Vladimir Putin to Adolf Hitler, but so far as I'm aware, Russia hasn't, created or committed a genocide against cultural religious minorities. They're not rounding up Jews in Russia. They're not rounding up gypsies in Russia. They're not rounding up the Romani in Russia or the Catholics, the Christians in Russia. They're not doing that. Not if I'm wrong, please tell me, and then I may have a different opinion on the matter, actually. But they're not doing that. In fact, the only place that there's a religious minority or cultural minority being rounded up is in China, and we don't seem interested in a war with them at all. I don't see one single ounce of any international interest in a kinetic military conflict with China, and they're actually rounding up cultural and ethnic minorities. Funny how that works. So Russia's not doing that. What is Russia actually asking for? They took Crimea, a very culturally Russian place. They've taken the Donbass, and anybody who knows about the region, there's a fault line there. On that fault line, you have people who are Ruski, who are Russian. You have Slavic people, and then you have Germanic people, and there's a fault line right there. And it's the entire region. It's not just on the Ukraine and Russia's border. It's the whole region. And there are people who are more culturally Russian. There are people who are more culturally German or Germanic. Okay. So let's say we split the territory in half and we send the two groups of people on either side back in the direction of their cultural heritage. And there's the peace. And that may be what Donald Trump eventually says or negotiates. But, guys, slow down. We're not going to nuclear war because some of the people that live on this side of the Ukraine border identify as Russian, and some of the people maybe on this side of Russia's border, it's probably a lot less, identify more as Ukraine or Germanic. And I'm talking about, again, in the Donbass region and in Crimea and in these other places that have a very rich Russian cultural heritage, because at one point, Ukraine was a part of Russia. It was a part of the Soviet Union. That's another piece of history that they never seem to reference in the mainstream media. 150 years ago, when America was just declaring its independence from Great Britain, the capital of the Russian Empire was in Kyiv. Before Stalingrad and Moscow. And I mean, don't get me wrong, 100-some years ago, 150 years ago is a long time ago, but we still reference that time period here in America. We reference it when we want to delegitimize America. We reference 1776. We reference European racist slave trade colonial, colonizers, settlers. We reference it then. We reference it when we want to affirm America in terms of 1776 being a time we declared our independence. So we reference our 250-year history all the time here in America. Why doesn't Russia get to? And I say all of this and people will go, well, man, why are you spending so much time with? We're on the brink of a nuclear war, people. We have to ask the question. We have to frame it up. We got to frame it up. We got to really ask ourselves, what's going on here? Before we go to war, full-blown war, world war, where more than 70 million people are going to die in 6-7 years because of the destructive capacity of the weapons, we got to ask ourselves, let's frame this thing up. Let's piece this thing up real quick. What is it that Russia's actually asking for? Is Russia asking for Lithuania and Poland and Romania and all these other Eastern Bloc countries? No, at least not by what they've said. Do they have? And we should. And right now, so what we've done is we've kind of floated on the surface and these sort of vague, esoteric agreements, right? And we called them load-bearing walls. We said all of these sort of tacit, implicit understandings between us and the international community and even Russia in some instances, all of these agreements are holding together the peace. And we've kind of floated on that house of cards. We've kind of floated on that for a while now. Okay. Now we're at a time of great conflict and people have drawn down. They've pulled those guns out and said, hey, we're ready to draw a hard line right here. Fine. Fine. Russia wants to draw a hard line. They want to renegotiate the split. That's how it happens. That's life. That's history. That's how society works. That's how politics works. That's how power works. They want to renegotiate. Okay. Well, we're going to have a renegotiation right here. This is going to be the renegotiating time. And wherever that line is drawn now, that's going to be the line. And then if you, Russia, Vladimir Putin, if you advance beyond that line going forward, now we got to come on back, because now you're spitting right in our face. You're saying, now you're basically calling us fools. Now you're saying we're going to go as far as we want, and you all are suckers. We're not suckers. We understand there's a unique history and cultural sort of dynamic going on there in eastern Ukraine. A lot of us America Firsters, a lot of us MAGA patriots, we can understand that a lot of our predecessors, these Democrat, liberal, globalist fuckheads, wanted to provoke Russia because for some reason they have a hard-on going all the way back to the great game of Great Britain and this entire Atlanticist European mindset. Some of it you Russians gotta own up to, because you let people like Stalin, you let the communists and the Bolsheviks take over your country and kill 20 million Christians under their rule. So part of it you gotta own up to as well. We don't trust you for good reason. But some of us can understand that the way America's been dealing in the region lately isn't right. It's not on the up and up. It's not honest. It's not intellectually or politically honest. Okay, cool. We're going to draw a new line. You take the Donbass, you take Crimea. Matter of fact, we may end up splitting Ukraine in half, right down the middle. And we'll send you this is Ukraine, this is now Russia, and there's the peace. Okay, but now, if you start to cross that, and guess what? We'll pull our weapons out of Ukraine as well. We don't need to have NATO weapons in Ukraine. In fact, if it was up to me, we'd start to demilitarize all along that NATO fault line, because technically speaking, from an American beliefs and values standpoint, having those weapons there justifies Russia's preemptive attacks and invasions. Because you don't have to fire the gun for somebody to be justified in protecting themselves and defending themselves. You just have to have the gun pointed at them. Okay. We'll start to pull American support back from any NATO project that advances weapons to Russia's border. That conflict is not in our best interest. It's not in our national interest as American citizens. We don't want that. We don't want a full-blown kinetic war, potential nuclear war with Russia. We don't want it. We'll do it if need be, but we would like to avoid it if possible, because we've seen what world wars do. You give a piece of yourself spiritually. You give a piece of yourself that you can never get back as a nation. We've seen that. So we would like to avoid a war if possible. So we'll start to draw back our support from militarizing on Russia's border with these other NATO countries. Let's actually reduce the footprint of NATO. Let's retract the footprint of NATO versus expand. And that means some of you countries that have joined NATO, some of you going to be out there in the cold. Yeah, some of you got to fend for yourselves. Now, as soon as you cross that line, Russia, as soon as you start to cross into Poland, as soon as you cross into that newly drawn Ukraine territory, then we got to come spank that ass, okay? And we will come spank that ass, and they know that. That's why Russia hasn't popped off all the way, right? Because nobody knows what anybody else has. That's the sort of unspoken understanding here. That's the kind of, secret of conflict, of military engagement. Nobody really knows what anybody else has until the shooting gets full tilt. So Russia, just like us, the two nuclear superpowers, neither one of us really knows what the other one has. No, neither one of us really knows, nor do we really want to have to find out. But if I was a United States Senator, what I would say is we're going to redraw, we're going to renegotiate. That makes sense because some people have not been dealing in earnest. And we as Americans and Westerners have to accept that we elected people that did not deal in good faith. They lied, they manipulated us, they manipulated our trust in them to lead, our trust in them to negotiate on our behalf. They manipulated it, they violated their role in government, in politics. So we understand we're going to have to renegotiate this now with Russia. We're going to draw some new lines. When we draw those new lines, if you cross those lines, we're going to come spank that ass. Fair? Okay, now see, and then now the game is set. See, and part of this is the game not being set, the lines not being drawn. The reason why Donald Trump is so feared is because he'll draw that line and then let everybody play from there. And that's what good leaders do. I have to take my hat off to him for it. We're going to draw a clear line. It's not going to be a vague, obscure sort of indeterminate line. We can't have lines like that because it's too easy for everybody to step across them and then say, I didn't really see it. You know, it's like if we played a game of volleyball there on the beach and there was no net. And we just said, hey, we're just going to have an imaginary line here in the sand. We're going to kind of create a line here in the sand and we're going to play volleyball and everybody agree that we're going to call the game fair. As soon as it gets competitive, you best believe that line's going to start, the sand's going to be getting pushed around and people going to start lying and pushing on that line. The sand's going to be pushed around, the line's going to get blurry, and people are going to start trying to test that line. You just know it. You just know it. It's natural. It's human. It's a part of the human condition. It's part of, competition. Here, the consequences are much, much greater than a beach volleyball game, let's say, right? I mean, these lines that we need to draw need to be definitive. And it allows everybody a better vantage of what's going on, and it ultimately allows us to preserve the peace. We got a better chance of preserving the peace when the lines are clear and definitive. When the lines are blurry and vague, it's real hard to figure out who your friends and who your enemies are. We don't know. We don't know. Maybe we don't know. Tell me how good our intelligence is there in Ukraine. Honestly, who can tell us that the Ukrainians and another thing that took place was we let the Ukrainians off the leash. We ran a coup there in Ukraine. We put some people in power who we knew we shouldn't have put in power. And we gave small arms to people there in eastern Ukraine, and they were very, very unkind, to say the least, to Russian cultural or ethnic Russians there in eastern Ukraine. Very unkind. There was some full-blown gang wars that popped off there in eastern Ukraine. And this was on the record. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is Vice and MSNBC and all these other major news outlets that covered the sort of local, regional conflict that broke out in the streets there of eastern Ukraine and in the Donbass region in that area, sort of that was politically fueled. Now, can we say with certainty that the CIA helped fuel or instigate, that little conflict there, that little regional, cultural, ethnic conflict there in eastern Ukraine and Russia? Can we say it for sure? No, but there's plenty of precedent to say that they're capable of it. It's certainly a common tactic, let's say, of our intelligence community to take certain groups and pit them against other groups to create instability and advance our own strategic interest. We know, and part of this make America great again, part of this make America healthy again, part of putting RFK in charge of the Department of Health, part of putting, certain individuals in certain places, part of this entire renaissance of America that's going to happen through this MAGA movement has to be a bit of a mea culpa. We know we were wrong. The American people, we were asleep at the wheel. We like the convenience. We like the materialism. We like the security, the illusion of security. We like the illusion of security so much. We were so comfortable. We were so comfortable at Bloomingdale's and Macy's and at our local, watering hole, local pub, drinking our Bud Light. We were so comfortable that we let our elected officials lie to us and tell us they were defending our national interests and our national security when really they were running coups and doing all kinds of other secret operations that were only to the benefit of the same people who are fucking you all over now. We got to do that. Mea culpa. And it's us. It's us. It's not just them. We let them represent us. And honestly, there was a part of us that knew. I mean, if we're going to be honest out there, if you're watching right now in the audience, can I get an amen? There was a part of us that knew. We knew when the Bushes and then Clinton and all that, we knew when they were up there smiling and waving. We knew there was a part of us that there was that Jiminy the Cricket there kind of saying, hey, these people must be doing some shady shit. Something don't sit right. Something don't smell right with these people. We knew. But that's what the rise of wealth and prosperity and luxury and technology, that's what the rise of those things do. It gets better and better at keeping people asleep and distracted. Okay, now we're awake. Ooh, boom, we got a kind of jolt to the system. We got a shock out of our sleep with this MAGA movement, with Donald Trump, with how hot and contentious and polarizing American politics have become. Great. Perfect. A little bit of it's going to be that mea culpa, that, we knew, you know what? We apologize. To the rest of the world, we're not going to let you come kill us. We're definitely not going to let you send us all your criminals or all your people in general. We're definitely not going to let you send us drugs. We're not going to let you gouge us in our trade agreements. We're not going to let you kill us. But we do have to have enough humility and courage to stand up on the world stage now and say, mea culpa. We knew. The American people have to say, we knew. We're not pulling a Silas from, was it the Da Vinci Code? The weird albino monk hitman who was whipping himself with the cat o' nine tails after every kill. That level of depravity and self-mutilation, because we understand our sins. I was telling somebody earlier, that was the great remedy of Christianity. Christianity acknowledges that people are flawed and are going to fall short of the standard. We continue to hold the ethic and standard, and we acknowledge when we've fallen short. That is a brilliant mechanism, and we need it now more than ever. Mea culpa. We were wrong. We were fooled. We were tricked, but part of us knew. We knew. We didn't have the courage to stand up politically. Now the people are standing up. Part of that standing up is Russia's going to redraw some lines. We're going to be there to negotiate, and that's going to be the peace. And if Russia decides to transgress beyond that new agreement, now we're in a whole new set of a type of conflict. And we got to deal with that when the time comes. And that time may come, and we may have to deal with it. And I'll be sitting here on a podcast or on a public stage somewhere saying, there was an agreement. It happened after the globalists. After we took back control from the globalists, there was an agreement that Russia wasn't going to cross over into this area. They crossed over. Now we got to go back. As much as it'll pain me. As much as it'll pain me to say that. Because I know as soon as it happens, there's a military industrial complex scam artist or a collection of them that can't wait for the circumstance to be able to march back in and start to manipulate and exploit us again. But as such is life. As such is life. It's never going to be perfect. It's never going to be perfect. It wouldn't be any fun if it was perfect. It's part of it. This is the push and pull. This is the yin and yang. This is the battle, the battle of principalities and spiritual forces. There's good and evil. We got to continue to fight that. Fight with it. Sometimes you ride the wave. Sometimes you crash. This is being human. And there's no reason to complain about it. We just talk about it. We talk it out. We We discuss it as as American citizens. We come to the public square. We put our ideas out there. We talk with other people. Sometimes you got to whip some ass. Sometimes you may be the 1 out of 100 that actually sees the thing clearly. And you got to stand up to those other 99 people and say, are you people fucking crazy? Because sometimes you'll get that mob. This is why our founding fathers were also brilliant. You'll get that mob energy going, that mob mentality, and people will, I mean, look at Jonestown. People got that mob energy going and they drank cyanide. It's fucking crazy. But it goes to show you, and whoever the minority was at Jonestown, whoever the 1 out of 500 and something was at Jonestown that says, hey, you guys think we should drink this fucking Kool-Aid? Seriously? I don't think we should do this shit. I'm not with this. You better believe there was a lot of people that looked at that one person like, what? You're not going to do it. What? It's like, no, I'm not. I'm that person. I'm that person that would have found my way to Jonestown somehow. I don't know. Maybe my parents brought me. I don't know. You know, they had, for some reason, my mom wouldn't have. She would have never been a part of any cult like that. But let's just say theoretically, I was a young, innocent kid that was brought to Jonestown by way of my parents getting involved in this cult. At 13 years old, I would have been the one to say, I'm not drinking that fucking Kool-Aid. I would have been, yep. I'd have been fake drinking and tossing that shit over the back of my shoulder like I'd have been dumped it under the table and ran off. And they would have found me when they came to find everybody was dead at Jonestown. There would have been one 13-year-old boy on the beaches surviving off the land until people showed up, and I would have said, I don't know what the fuck these people were thinking. Whoa, these people were tripping. They tripped out. But that's the dangers of that mob rule, right? So that's part of being an American citizen too. Sometimes a person like me has to stand up at the Minnesota Republican Party and the American Republican Party and say, you people have lost your fucking minds with this neocon Atlanticist Upper East Coast Ivy League elite bullshit. Because you're just as much invested in this war with Russia and Ukraine as the Democrats. This has been another episode of Please Call Me Crazy, brought to you by Free People Radio and powered by our favorite sponsor, TireGet.com. That's TireGet.com. You have to buy tires from somebody. You might as well buy them from us. Help fund the movement, help support the movement. We believe in your freedom of movement, and that's exactly what the establishment wants to take from you now. Friday, we're going to do Hebrews with the great Professor Penn, Ukrainian Jew himself, very familiar with the area, very familiar with the region, very familiar with the history, the cultural history, the religious history, the ethnic history. So I definitely want to have a Hebrews episode with him on the doorstep of what could possibly be World War III and a nuclear exchange. Hey, these are the times we live in. I don't mean to be dark or morose, but this is the reality. If we make it to Friday, who knows? I mean, that's kind of how crazy things are. Other than that, Saturday morning, again, the Royce White Show, Real America's Voice, 9 a.m. Eastern. Make sure if you're not already, follow the War Room on all social media pages. They are streaming the podcast both on their Rumble and on their Getter page. Shout out to the War Room, Maureen Bannon, Grace Chong, Young Cameron, and as always, the great Steve Bannon. These people, we've been sounding this alarm for a long time, for a long, long time. And you know, this issue with Russia and Ukraine is coming to a climax right here, right now. And I think the peace will prevail. Honestly, I think Vladimir Putin, as crazy as they try to make him seem, is rational and reasonable enough to realize that he's being provoked, that he's intentionally being provoked to try and avoid a transfer of power. And I think when Donald Trump gets in, I guarantee Donald Trump's probably already having conversations with Vladimir Putin and Zelensky as well, ongoing conversations with the two of them. And I think the cooler heads will prevail. Now, I personally don't trust Zelensky whatsoever. That's just me. I don't trust anything Zelensky would say to anyone, especially Donald Trump, especially right now. I think Zelensky is a plant. I think he was put there by the deep state, by this globalist regime who ran this coup, and I think they have a strange fixation with Russia and Putin, and the entire thing is way off the rails. So I don't trust anything Zelensky would say. I also don't necessarily trust what Vladimir Putin would say, but I do think he has the Russian people's interest and well-being and survival in mind. And listen, they've been telling us since the height of the Cold War that the Russians were crazy and they would let off a nuclear weapon. They have the nuclear weapons. They haven't let them off yet. Does that mean that they won't let them off? Absolutely, it does not mean that. Does it mean they've shown time and time again that cooler heads can prevail? Yes, they have shown that. And so we can be hopeful. Prepare for the best. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. We'll see you again on Friday. The fight continues. As always, Godspeed.